Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to session 4.2 here in Virtual Room 2, where we're going to be discussing the ocean and COVID-19. It's a lot of numbers to be starting off with. Thank you for tuning in from wherever you are to follow this virtual EU Green Week conference, heralding a new beginning for people and for nature. My name is Aminda Lee. I'm a British-Italian journalist and moderator specializing in environmental topics. I'm logged in today from Rome, where it is a glorious day, in fact, perfect for being at the seaside. I'm honored to be your moderator for this session at Green Week, which I've been attending for more than a decade, though of course this year it's a rather different experience for all of us. In a moment, I'm going to explain how this session will work, but first I have a few housekeeping pointers. You can send in questions to the speakers by pressing the big question mark button on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. There's also a chat function for exchanging messages with other people watching this session. Just click Join Chat on the left-hand side of the bottom of the screen, displaying the session's video and slides. And of course, please do share your thoughts in the usual, now rather old-fashioned way on Twitter using the hashtag EU Green Week. But I hope that most of the time you're going to be carefully listening to the high-powered speakers we have online today. I'm going to introduce them briefly for a moment. And when I say your name, please switch on your microphone. We have Matt White, who is a scientist from the University of Exeter and the University of Vienna. Say hello.
Yeah, I said good afternoon, everybody.
Okay, I didn't hear that, sorry. We have Vera Coelho, who is Senior Director Advocacy in Europe at the NGO Oceana.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody.
We have Brian O'Riordan, who is the Executive Secretary of the Low Impact Fishers of Europe platform called LIFE. Brian?
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome, nice to be here. Hope you're all keeping safe and well and look forward to speaking later on.
And last but not least, we have Monika Mcdevitt, who is Chief of the Chemicals and Health Branch in the Economy Division at the United Nations Environment Programme.
Afternoon, everyone, and welcome and glad to be joining this panel from a chilly Geneva. Thank you.
Well, we're going to be hearing more from all of them in a moment. Over the next hour, we're going to be discussing the oceans and COVID-19. The oceans represent 99% of the habitable volume on Earth. They provide habitats for rich, yet often known marine biodiversity. The oceans also support essential services for people, like providing fish, mitigating climate change, supporting the design of new pharmaceutical products, or offering recreation opportunities. So protecting the marine environment is not only crucial for the conservation of biodiversity, but also for the well-being of us human beings and our planet. This year's pandemic has been a real shock for our societies and economy, and its consequences for the natural environment are still very much unknown. But it has also opened a door and given us an opportunity to rethink our way of life and our relationship with nature. In Europe, we have the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, one of the most comprehensive and ambitious marine policies in the world. It tries to strike the right balance between economic activities, social fairness, and achievement of good environmental status. The state of Europe's seas is slowly improving, and they are gradually moving towards reaching that good environmental status. But even so, there are some worrying signs about the environmental health and cleanliness of our seas. For example, due to the effects of overfishing, plastic litter, pollution, or underwater noise. The new EU Biodiversity Strategy brings renewed hope that urgent and coherent action for the protection and restoration of our seas is underway. Now more than ever, we realise how fragile we are. We need to increase our respect for the seas and the ocean. We cannot continue to extract marine resources uncontrollably and to pollute the seas irresponsibly. This reflection is the starting point for our session, which has been structured to offer plenty of opportunities for you to ask questions via the question mark button on your screen. After we've heard from the first two speakers, there will be time for your questions to them. After that, we're going to hear from the second two speakers, and there will be a longer question time for questions to them and all the panelists. So, without any further delay, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Matt White is an environmental psychologist researching natural environments, pro-environmental behaviour, and health and well-being. Since 2011, he's been coordinating the Blue Gym project, exploring the health and well-being benefits of marine and inland waters, for which he won the 2019 Delcroix Prize in Oceans and Human Health. Today, he's going to give us a scientific perspective and tell us why spending time at the sea really is good for us. Matt White, over to you.
Thanks, Arminda. So I'm Matt White. I'm an environmental psychologist. I specialize in mental health, but I've been working in a medical school for the last 10 years. So we've looked at a whole range of health outcomes. I literally moved to Vienna last week, so I'm in that kind of transition period. The talk today, I'll just give you a brief history of a discussion of oceans and human health more broadly, some of the most recent evidence that's been gathered over the last decades, and some implications for COVID-19, although of course that a lot of this data is very, very new and fresh. So this is very early days to make extrapolations about what COVID-19 might mean. As I'm sure everybody on the call is aware, there's plenty of risks to health from the oceans, not least drowning, 370,000 estimated deaths from drowning a year. Millions of people around the world die of polluted waters and so on. We're not dismissing any of those risks. They're real, they're very, very large. What we've been trying to do over the last 10 years is counterbalance some of those risks with some of the benefits. The benefits have been explored for millennium. In the UK, they were really started to be taken seriously by Dr. Richard Russell in the 1750s, who convinced the local royalty at the time that bathing in sea waters was good for their health. A number of sea bathing hospitals was set up. These were kept open for 200 years or so. Serious articles in things like the Lancet, premier medical journals were discussing the importance of oceans and human health. But in the latter part of the 20th century, this really died out in all but a few pockets, such as thalassotherapy in Belgium. And partly that's to do with the changing types of public health need. The 21st century worries are about obesity, diabetes, mental health. And increasingly, we're realizing that the ecological systems upon which all life depends, of course, influences human health. And we're moving to an ecological public health approach to try and understand how the oceans, as well as inland and terrestrial environments, affect our health and well-being. Aminda referred to the Blue Gym, Blue Health program over the last 10 years. We've tried to use data from all sorts and all sectors to try and build an evidence case. We've used census data, repeat cross-sectional surveys, cohort studies, visitor surveys, experiments of field and lab. We've looked at qualitative interviews and systematic reviews to build a really comprehensive picture of what the relationship is between the oceans and human health. To give you a brief idea, there's lots of different exposure pathways, of course. You could live near, so, being home proximity. You can have indirect contact, which might be through views or watching the television, actually can also restore mental health benefits, watching Blue Planet and so on. You can have incidental contact. You might be commuting to work, but you happen to be commuting on the coast. You could get benefits unintentionally, or you could make intentional visits. And there's a whole host of health and wellbeing outcomes that's related to. So some early data, we looked at the UK census, 48 million adults. To cut a long story short, people were healthier if they lived at the coast. The effects were relatively small, but they apply to many millions of people. So you can multiply that up. Importantly for us, the health benefits were strongest in poorest communities. It doesn't matter if you're wealthy, really, where you live, you're pretty relatively healthy. Poorer communities were healthier at the coast than similar communities inland. And of course, we've been trying to understand why that is. This is cross-sectional data. We've also done longitudinal data, and we find people's health and well-being goes up when they move towards the coast, and it goes down when they move inland. So why might this be? There's three core pathways which we summarize as mitigation, instauration, and restoration. Mitigation, things such as urban heat island effects are reduced at the coast, as I'm sure many of you will understand. But other things are more actively human. We've found in several countries now that people are more likely to take exercise if they live near the coast. And of course, exercise is associated with a whole range of health and wellbeing benefits. People are also happier when they're at the coast. Longitudinal works that follows people over time finds that, for example, happiness ratings are highest in marine environments by about 6% higher than when they're in urban environments. Again, more happiness than in other areas such as mountains. The other key thing about the coast is it's used by all sectors of society, as opposed to, say, woodlands, which tends to be used only by the richest members of society in a number of countries. But also the motives to spend time at the coast are social. People are going there to spend time with friends and families, unlike, for example, inland areas like woodlands, where they go specifically for health reasons. Now, of course, that has implications for COVID-19, as we'll discuss later. The EU and nation states have put in a lot of effort to try and improve exposures to health and well-being. Sorry, I seem to have lost the slides. Yeah, thanks. The EU have put in a number of measures, for example, the revised bathing water directives with the new signage. And we've been doing some research in 14 different countries to understand the value people have of not only the bathing water experience, but also what happens when bathing water improves or it actually gets worse on these metrics. And the current estimates are around £500 billion per year of value of good quality bathing waters. And I'm happy to discuss those numbers later. There's also much more small scale interventions that can be done at local levels. This was one of 7 interventions we did as part of the EU Blue Health project. This was done in Plymouth. It cost about £90,000. It was in a relatively deprived area. It was large social housing. And what we were able to do was double the number of visits to the coastal area. We've also been looking at various health and wellbeing metrics. So the idea here is that you can do this at the EU scale, but you can also do it at a much local level where you can target specific health and wellbeing outcomes. So what does this all mean for COVID-19? There's actually very, very little research done on health. It's just too soon to be looking at this. But the UK government has been monitoring park use during COVID, and it's seen significant increases amongst many groups. Not all groups, of course. People with pre-existing health conditions have tended to isolate, so they haven't been going out to parks as much. And over the next few weeks, we'll be analysing visits to coastal areas in particular, seeing who's making them, how long they're doing them for, and what are the potential implications. In a study that's currently under revision for Science and the Total Environment, we looked at 6 countries, actually many countries, but 6 countries across Europe under different conditions of lockdown. And to cut a long story short, if you had a view of nature, including a coastal view, your likelihood of depression symptoms was lower under all lockdown conditions. If you had access to a private garden, depression was lower. In Spain, where there was severe lockdown restrictions in the early days, it wasn't so important for other countries, which makes sense because you could still go and visit the coast. In other words, gardens weren't as important for countries where you still had access to public parks and the coast, which could be really important going into lockdown phase number 2. We need to keep access to these places for people's mental health is the summary of that. So to cut a long story short, the take-home message is normally living near and spending time in coastal marine environments is good for health and well-being. The mechanisms include things like temperature regulation, increased physical activity, de-stressing, promotion of mental health. Many interventions at the national, international and local level can help improve access to the coast for people, especially in more deprived areas. They're the people who benefit most. However, the coast is used to spend time with friends and family. Now, normally that's a good thing for our mental health, but of course it could lead to spreads of infection. So we need to monitor and get a handle on that, not just let these places be used willy-nilly. At the moment, we're starting to build a picture of green space use during COVID. That's most governments' priorities. Only now we're starting to roll that out to understand the implications for coastal and marine settings. And this is just a thank you to all the people involved in this research over the last decade. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Matt. That was absolutely fascinating. I cannot believe that just watching the sea or the ocean on television is good for us. That's an incredible finding. And I also, it was interesting to know that our happiness increases by 6% at the coast. You're making me want to leave the house and go today, but I will stay in my chair because we have more interesting speakers to come. Please don't forget to send in your questions to Matt and to our next speaker too, as we'll be asking them after the next presentation with another question time after that as well. So we know the sea is good for us. We've heard that already from Matt, but have we been good to the sea? In fact, the marine environment and communities depending on it are very vulnerable. Our next speaker, Vera Coelho, has spent her career pushing for support and leadership in the protection of freshwater and saltwater ecosystems with better marine conservation and fisheries management. In her role at Oceana, she leads the organization's policy communications and science work. This afternoon, she's going to urge the EU to make its post-COVID recovery package both green and blue. Vera Coelho, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alinda. All right, so as you may remember, at the very beginning of the coronavirus pandemic and as the first lockdowns were instituted, we saw lots of media reports emerging saying that, the pandemic was actually good for the environment, including the marine environment. And all of us have seen these media reports saying that, wildlife was taking over cities and nature was thriving in the absence of humans. But of course, we know that this is not the case. Any positive impacts that there may have been during the pandemic were very small and also temporary. At the same time, while we stay in this coronavirus-dominated circumstance, I'm sure that you cannot read, for example, the small print in this slide. But basically, the headline says, marine life thrives in the Mediterranean during virus lockdown. But if you look at the sidebar, which has more news, it includes headlines like, deepest ocean depths are warming at an unprecedented rate, the warmest in 2,900 years. So the coronavirus pandemic, as overwhelming as it has been for us as a society, unfortunately cannot mask the gigantic crisis that is being borne by the ocean, especially in terms of climate impacts and also the biodiversity crisis. Last year, all alarm bells were ringing, and this was highlighted by two very important reports that came out. The first one was the Ipbs Global Assessment on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which made headlines throughout the world by stating that there were 1 million species at risk of extinction, many of those, of course, marine species. And it also highlighted that fishing continues to be the biggest driver of biodiversity loss in the ocean. It also stated that these trends are being compounded, of course, by climate change. And indeed, later in the year, the IPCC released its special report on the ocean and cryosphere in a changing climate, which also explained that the ocean has absorbed up to 90% of the excess heat in the climate system that has been generated since the 1970s. And this, in addition to absorption of CO2 and acidification, is having profound impacts on marine ecosystems and, of course, on the people that depend on them. So it's clear that these trends are unsustainable and that we really need to change our trajectory. So early this year, before the lockdowns hit, a group of over 100 NGOs came together to develop a roadmap to recover our marine ecosystems back to a healthy state by 2030. And we called it our Blue Manifesto. And this was really our response to all those reports and alarm bells, but also our input to the European Green Deal and to all the initiatives that are forthcoming in its wake. So again, I'm sure you cannot read the small print on the slide, but just to highlight that the Blue Manifesto is a roadmap. It's an action plan with key actions to be taken in the course of the next decade to achieve this vision of healthy seas and oceans. And the actions that we've detailed roll around three main axes of intervention. Firstly, protect and restore nature and natural areas. Secondly, transition to sustainable and low-impact seafood systems. And thirdly, halt pollution. Now, of course, in the meantime, the EU and its member states are discussing and negotiating its next multi-year budget and also the COVID recovery instrument. So it is essential that we use this moment as an inflection point, and that we really make sure that any future investments, any support really contributes to changing course and to putting us on the path to recovery and to this more sustainable future. So again, a group of NGOs came together and developed a set of ideas and recommendations for sustainable investments that could be supported in the context of this new budget, and that would be beneficial for the ocean and for the European economic recovery. And again, we based those recommendations along the same three axes of intervention from the Blue Manifesto. So looking at a few selected examples from this document, and of course focusing on areas where Oceana is currently campaigning on. So if we start with nature restoration and conservation, as we know, marine protected areas, or NPAs, are havens for biodiversity as well as buffers against climate impacts. And they are beneficial to fisheries as well, because the extra fish spill out of these protected areas and provide a resource for the fishing industry. Now, the EU has adopted and achieved a target of designating 10% of its marine area as protected, and is currently considering adopting a new target of 30%. However, management of these areas is almost entirely lacking. Currently, 85% of the marine protected areas in Europe do not have a management plan. And if you look at it by area, right now, less than 2% of the EU's marine area falls within one of these rare MPAs that actually has a management plan. And even the areas that do have management plans in place still continue to allow the most destructive fishing activities, including bottom trawling, overwhelmingly. So strict protection is really urgently needed. We need to move towards a system where we effectively protect these important areas. And we need, on the one hand, to have no-take zones, which are the highest form of protection, but also the ones that deliver the highest level of benefits in terms of biodiversity and fisheries. And then in the other areas where we do allow fishing to continue, we need to really invest and transition towards low-impact fishing gears, fishing methods that are also very important to maintain marine biodiversity, but also for local communities. And I'm sure Brian will tell us more about that in a moment. And this links, of course, very much to the issue of transitioning to sustainable and low-impact seafood. On the one hand, it is essential to end overfishing and restore fish populations to healthy levels. And the EU has committed to doing this, and doing this has been shown to be highly beneficial. The EU could stand to gain an extra 1.6 billion euros in annual revenue and an extra 20,000 jobs if we restored all of our fish stocks to healthy levels. So step number one is to finally end overfishing, as we have committed to do, and restore our fish stocks. Then, as we were discussing in the context of MPAs, removing fish biomass from the ocean is not the only impact of fishing activities. So transitioning to low impact fishing is also very important in this regard of food security. And finally, scientific data and information really needs to underpin fisheries management in Europe and elsewhere. So it is extremely important that we have full documentation of catches and full information about seafood products throughout the supply chain, so that we can underpin scientific advice, stock assessments, recommendations for the level of catch quotas, and therefore investing in instruments such as electronic logbooks to document this information would be also a worthwhile investment moving forward. And it would help us also to start tackling issues of illegal, unregulated, and unreported, or IUU fishing. So in addition to having electronic catch reporting, there's other investments that could and should be made to make sure that there is indeed more fairness and a level playing field for those fishers that actually do comply with the rules. Several member states have instituted remote electronic monitoring systems for the entirety of their fleet, and it's been shown also that the technology is going down in price and increasing the quality of the data. So there's a very strong case to roll out these systems to the entirety of the fleet. And similarly, there's very promising pilots of extending vessel tracking technology to all fleet segments, including the small sail segment, which will be beneficial not only in terms of control and verifying, for example, if vessels are entering protected areas, but it's also essential to keep our fishermen safe at sea and to know where vessels are at any moment, so that in case of danger or emergency, those people can be helped in a timely fashion.
Thank you, Vera. I'm going to have to stop you there because I'd like to get some questions. So if you'd just like to conclude, please.
So I was just going to say that some investments or some measures don't really need that much investment, because it's just about making public the efforts that are currently being made. For example, in terms of fisheries controls, member states currently report to the European Commission on their annual efforts to control their fisheries, and simply making this information available would go a long way to creating trust and transparency and showing that there are efforts to make a level playing field among fishers in different member states. And this is then my last slide, which is just a summary of the key messages. So first and foremost, we must not forget that the ocean is indeed under intense and growing pressure and really bearing the brunt of the climate crisis, as well as suffering from the biodiversity crisis. We absolutely need to bounce forward and build back better post-COVID. And we do have the tools, the information to do it. And we are at a moment in European policy making where we are making the decisions that will determine whether we change our trajectory. So it's very important that future investments and regulation be in line with the ambitions of the European Green Deal, and that we make use of these opportunities for win-win-win solutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Vera. That's very optimistic. And I'm sure that Brian will have some things to say about some of your suggestions on fishery. Now, I'd like to go straight to the questions from the audience. We have one from Sophia, which says, to what extent do innovative, technological, nature-based solutions provide hope to future-proof our world and in particularly our oceans? I don't know whether, Matt, do you want to, have you been doing any work on nature-based solutions?
Yes, but not in relation particularly to the oceans. I mean, I guess the only technology thing we've been working with the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation here in the UK, looking at how the impact of programs such as Blue Planet 2 or the recent Extinction, the Facts, how those programs can be best structured, the way in which they can communicate to mass audiences to best hit home. So, for example, if you saw the Extinction, the Facts, there were lots of negative news stories, but much as Vera did there, it finished on a positive hope appeal, because otherwise people get so despondent. And it also outlines behavioral change techniques by which, okay, we need to do this, this, and this, and this, which people need, obviously, in order to build up personal efficacy to think they can do something. I'm more skeptical of technological solutions such as, well, we can have a big Hoover to suck up the plastics from the oceans. The real issue is people's behavior at source and product design. So some of the solutions to clear up the mess seem to me less effective than dealing with the problem at source. But obviously Vera can speak more about the biodiversity issues.
In fact, Vera, would you like to come in quickly on the biodiversity side of this?
Sure. I think it's indeed important to be aware of technological fixes, as Mathew was saying, but there is a lot that we can do in terms of nature-based solutions and then supporting them from the technology side. So if you think about marine reserves and giving the space to nature to, conserve what is still there or restore areas that have been damaged, I think, just leaving nature to its devices can be a very effective nature-based solution. And then you complement it with technologies such as remote monitoring, satellite vessel tracking, traceability of products through digital means that really allow you to enforce those protected areas or make sure that they are, effectively protected and delivering the nature outcomes that we want from them, as well as benefits in terms of fisheries. So I think there's really a lot that can be there, that can be done there. In terms of coastal ecosystems, there is really a lot of evidence that nature-based solutions are extremely effective at recovering natural areas with benefits for buffering the worst impacts of climate change in terms of storm surges or coastal erosion. So there's a wealth of experience and knowledge out there on how, using nature or working with nature to buffer some of the impacts that we see coming can be extremely effective. And the technology then allows us to monitor, see what is happening, find better ways or more efficient ways of working with nature to make those projects happen.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to ask Matt, what more should be done to forge a closer connection between health and the environment in policymakers' minds?
So one of the things we've been looking at in a project called SOPHIE, which is an EU-funded project, sees oceans and public health in Europe. One of the big challenges is that environmental policies are often at the international level. For example, the EU level makes decisions about EU bathing quality, whereas health policies tend to be at the nation state level. So they don't tend to be spread across. So joining up medics, doctors, health professionals in countries to think about this supranational coordination that's been needed has actually been a real challenge for us over the last few years. And I think that's what's needed for the health community to really get together behind the need to protect things like the oceans for health.
In fact, just while you're talking about doctors, you and I, when we were talking to prepare this session, you were talking about the fact that doctors are now starting to issue green and blue prescriptions. Can you just tell us in a nutshell what that is?
In a nutshell, it's going back 250 years and saying to people, particularly with things like mental health issues, how about spending an hour or two a week at the coast? Because the evidence is now so strong that that will be good for your mental health. This is not substituting, for example, chemical or talk therapies. It's saying it's a complementary therapy that you might want to do alongside. And this is happening globally at the moment. It's a little bit of a Wild West because everyone's doing it with well-meaning intentions, but sometimes it goes wrong. So, for example, we're increasingly seeing if people feel pressured to do this, to go to visit the coast, it can actually undermine their enjoyment. So this has to be handled quite carefully. And there's international collaboration to try and improve the standards and targets and mechanisms by which green and blue prescriptions are being delivered. But once we work out what the economic return on investment of this is, it could be really important to show that quality marine environments could produce quality health outcomes. And I reiterate, following Vera, that quality matters. We've seen time and time again that polluted marine environments do not deliver the same benefits to health that higher quality ones do.
Interesting point. Thank you. Vera, I've got a question for you from Eva. It says, we expect a big blue economy increase towards 2030. How do you see that in the context of the current generally poor state of Europe's seas and your blue manifesto? If you could give us a short answer, that would be great.
Yes, I think it's something to look out for because, of course, as budgets are being created, there's also this tendency to think, okay, how can we spend the money? How can we kickstart the economy? How can we invest? And often this results in subsidies or investments to, old ways of doing things and the ways of doing things that have delivered precisely this poor state of Europe's seas that we verify right now. So I think this is really the moment to make decisions and to think of what kind of blue economy do we want to have in the future. So where do we want to be in 2030 and beyond? And it's the moment to reflect on whether we should still be investing in the old models that have resulted in, environmental destruction with the consequences, as Matt was highlighting, on well-being of humans, economic, mental, etc., Or do we want to really invest in these innovative solutions that will benefit the marine environment, as well as creating these more sustainable economic opportunities in future that won't be so subsidy dependent, for example, or that will really deliver different benefits for different sectors of the economy.
Okay, thank you. We do have some more questions, but we're not going to go to them now. We'll hold them back for the next round, which is going to come up after our next two speakers. First of all, Vera has already touched on the economic fallout of the COVID-19 crisis. And of course, one of the sectors that has been affected is fishing, especially for small-scale fishermen, or fishers, as they are now referred to in a gender-neutral way. To tell us more about this aspect, we have Brian O'Riordan. He has a background in fisheries biology, project management and advocacy, and he represents the Low Impact Fishers of Europe platform, LIFE platform for short. It was launched in 2012 to give a voice to Europe's small-scale, low-impact fishers, often referred to as the forgotten fleet. And indeed, as Brian will tell us during his talk, this fleet was forgotten once again during the COVID-19 pandemic. Brian O'Riordan, please tell us more.
Thank you very much, Aminda. Good afternoon, everybody. So, as you all know, fishing comes in all shapes, sizes and varieties, from very, very small scale, people fishing on a beach, to enormous ocean-going trawlers over 100 meters long, factory vessels. We can think about commercial fishing, recreational fishing, and subsistence fishing. So what I want to focus on this afternoon is the commercial fleets, which worldwide extract about 80 to 100 million tons of fish from the sea, which here in Europe we extract about 5.5 million tons, 95% of which is extracted by what are known as larger scale, more intensive vessels. When we talk about the fleet in Europe, it can be broadly split between two main segments. The segment which I deal with, which is the smaller vessels, which are under 12 meters long and use what are known as passive gears. These are gears which don't require towing through the water. They are hooks and lines, nets which may be fixed or drifting in the water, generally a small amount of gear, fished by vessels which spend less than 24 hours at sea and land fish daily, which is fresh of very high quality. This is quite a different kind of activity. It falls into the category of what we would call artisanal or small-scale, low-impact fishing. Low impact because it has a relatively low impact on the seabed. It has a relatively low impact on the stocks because the gears used are highly selective. And it's a seasonal activity in as much as fishermen traditionally fish different stocks in different seasons on different fishing grounds. So in a sense, the small-scale fleets compared to small-scale agriculture, which has a kind of cyclical process of cycling crops in different fields during different years or different seasons. In the same sense, fishermen may fish for certain kinds of fish in one season and other kinds of fish in others. This is a very different kind of fishing to the majority of fish which is caught by European fleets, which tends to target a limited number of species, which tends to use very non-selective techniques which harvest at one end of the range entire shoals of fish, which can be located using sophisticated fish finding devices. So these very intensive fishing methods are the ones I think which need to be curtailed. These very intensive fishing methods are the methods which, thanks to the post-war policies that Europe introduced in the 1950s to rebuild war-torn economies, create jobs, produce more food, this has led to an industrialization process. And today you could say that the common fishing policy is a policy which promotes industrial fishing and which the small-scale, low-impact fleet is hardly visible. Generally, it's a tug-of-war between member states and the European Union as to whether small-scale fisheries are dealt with at European level or at member states level. So this is why we tend to refer to the fleet as the forgotten fleet, because generally it is exempted from many of the rules, regulations, provisions of the common fishing policy. And although it accounts for something like 80% of the fleet in terms of vessel numbers, provides 50% of the employment, it is only responsible for 5% of the catch. And the reason the catch rate is so low is partly because of the low impact technique, but it's also because within Europe we have a quota system, and up until the more or less 2005, 2006, the small-scale fleet was not bound by the quota system. The small-scale fleet, because its catches were so small, was basically allowed to catch whatever fish it was allowed to catch. It was what I would call a polyvalent fleet. This all changed in roughly 2006 when it was realized that perhaps more fish was being caught by the small-scale fleet than was being accounted for, and that a lot of fish was being sold illegally. So some new regulations came in which made it incumbent on fish buyers and sellers to account from where their fish came from. So at that time, 2005, 2006, most small-scale fishing boats were then shut off from catching quota species, which meant that they could only focus on catching fish species which are not subject to quota. And this obviously constrains where they can fish, when they can fish, how they can fish. And for most of the non-quota species they catch, these are not species that you find every day on your plate. These are more the species like the lobster, crabs, prawns, fish which go mainly for export. So what we're calling for in life is to have a policy reform, and I think COVID-19 provides us with a huge opportunity for such a policy reform, which could see the redistribution of fishing quotas to give the small-scale sector a much fairer allocation of fishing access rights, but also a realignment of the fishing subsidies, which during the 1970s and 1980s led to this industrialization of the fishing fleets. These fishing subsidies could now be reassigned to supporting more local, small-scale collective projects, so that these public monies would not actually be used for destroying the public resources which fisheries are, but rather promoting the public good. To come back to COVID-19, as Vera highlighted, has had a very limited impact on the fishery resources. Any kind of holiday that may have been experienced in the early months of the year, March and April, were quickly lost as fishermen began to return to the sea. But COVID-19 did have a huge impact on the fishing sector, basically by collapsing the markets. And what I mean by collapsing the markets, in the early months of the year and again now, we see hotels and restaurants closing, which is one of the main markets for fresh fish products. But also export markets were closed, road transport, and the movement of goods, particularly products, agricultural and fishery products around Europe, was curtailed. And this meant that the prices that fishermen were getting on the market more or less collapsed to zero, very, very low levels. And what we've seen over the last few months is a lot of very innovative projects where fishermen have tried, small-scale fishermen in particular, have tried to link more directly with consumers, where the very high-quality fresh fish, which is landed by the small-scale sector, using techniques which are fairly low impact on the environment, these products which are more sustainable, which are fresher, which can link consumers more directly with producers and can provide health benefits both to the fishermen in terms of better income and to the consumer in terms of a higher quality product, are quite important. So what we would like to see is an investment of rebuilding funds in helping small-scale fishermen to organize themselves better in terms of marketing infrastructure so that they can have cold storage facilities and transport facilities and link more closely to transport facilities, which can get their catches more directly to their consumers in good, fresh conditions. During the COVID pandemic, the European Union intervened very importantly by providing aid to member states to support their fishing fleets. Now, this aid took the form, on the one hand, of support to fishing companies so that they could, if they wanted to, tie up their vessels for 2 or 3 months while the COVID pandemic blew over, as it were, or the aid was used for what was called storage aid. So the vessels could keep fishing at sea and have the cold storage charges for their fish when they landed it paid for by these public funds. So neither of these two funds really helped the small-scale sector. First of all, partly because a lot of the small-scale catches are not accounted for by the fish buyers. So in order to avail of these funds, the small-scale fishers had to show that they had landings worth more than a certain level, worth more than €5,000 in the previous year.
And Brian, can I just ask you to come to a conclusion, please?
So basically, often it's difficult for small-scale fishers to make their claims because the middlemen who've been buying their catches have not declared to the public authorities that a certain component of what they're buying and selling has come from the small-scale sector. So this is why we talk about the forgotten fleet, because whether it's in the marketplace, whether it's in the European policy, or whether it's in the mind of the public, the small-scale fleet is only really ever seen when people take their holidays and visit fishing communities and they see small boats in the harbour. But in terms of the policy radar, this forgotten fleet doesn't really show up. So really we need to make a lot of effort to make sure that it does show up and that its efforts at sustainability and providing healthy products are properly rewarded. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Brian. Sorry to cut you short, but time always runs away with us. It's interesting what you talk about, the opportunity for fishing reform. Well, we'll see if that happens. Now I'd like to invite our next speaker, to introduce our next speaker, our final speaker, who is Monika Mcdevitt from the United Nations Environment Programme. She's an environmental physiologist and has worked extensively in applied science and technology innovation in the fields of coastal and marine development, among others. Today, she's going to explore the relationship between the ocean and COVID-19, looking more at what we can do to protect biodiversity in our seas and highlighting the need for us to ask ourselves some new questions. Monika Mcdevitt, it's over to you.
Very much, Aminda, and I also want to thank the speakers who have gone before me. They've raised some very important issues that I think are relevant to the kind of comments that I'm going to make this afternoon. So, given the time that we have, I'm just going to frame a lot of my comments largely around the topic of pollution. So let me just introduce it a little bit here. As we all know, pollution certainly touches all parts of the planet. There's really no place on Earth now that remains totally unpolluted. It also affects our health through the food we eat, and the water we drink, and the air we breathe. The World Health Organization, for example, has estimated that nearly a quarter of all deaths worldwide are due to environmental causes. Pollution itself is the largest environmental cause of disease in the world today, responsible for an estimated 9 million premature deaths. And this is taken from the Lancet Commission report that came out in 2017. So it may not appear apparent that the current coronavirus pandemic and oceans are related. So let me sort of give you how I'm going to structure my comments. Firstly, why should we be concerned about, COVID-19 in the oceans? They seem to be, worlds apart. Secondly, it's not just about the physical debris or waste that we can see that has been generated through the response to the pandemic, but it's also the unseen components that we need to be mindful of as well. Thirdly, and I can't, miss the opportunity to say, well, what is UNEP doing about this? And finally, what are some of the gaps that need to be tackled? So let me carry on with that. Why should we be concerned about COVID-19 in the oceans? Well, with the pandemic and the response to the pandemic, we have seen an enormous increase in the consumption of medical products, masks and gloves made of plastic, textiles, and other single-use products. If not properly handled, these could degrade into smaller and smaller pieces and contribute to the already alarming amount of plastic, microplastics, and microfiber pollution in wastewater. After being washed off together with other pollutants such as pharmaceuticals, they eventually end up in our waterways and ultimately can reach our oceans, damaging coastal and marine ecosystems. This pandemic has also showed that there's an inextricable link between COVID-19, wastewater, and sanitation. On the one side, many people who live in disadvantaged situations may lack basic services such as access to clean water, basic sanitation, and everything else that is necessary to ensure good hygiene. And also the things that are needed to prevent the spread of bacteria and viruses, including our friend COVID-19. Raw sewage and partially treated wastewater are vehicles for spreading disease. We also don't know the impact of the vast volumes of disinfectants and other chemicals that have been used since the outset of the pandemic as they get washed off into the runoff and sewage systems worldwide and ultimately into waterways and the ocean. So as I said at the outset, it's not just about what we can see, but it's also the unseen components that we need to be mindful of. We know that there are many types of pollution that end up in the ocean. And this very much goes from what we've talked about earlier, or what previous speakers have talked about earlier, in terms of, how do we manage the ecosystems, from the land to the sea? And it's something that we call the source to sea approach. Currently, the most well-recognized is plastic. We've all heard about plastic and the vast quantities of plastic that end up in the ocean. But there are many other types of waste that also cause untold damage to marine and coastal ecosystems. These include discarded nets, nutrient runoff, antibiotics, pharmaceuticals, heavy metals, industrial chemicals, pesticides, oil, gas, and non-plastic solid waste. Unfortunately, we often use our waterways and the oceans as a giant reservoir or receptacle for all of our waste, and we can really no longer continue to afford to just keep thinking of water writ large as simply a vehicle for getting rid of what we no longer want to see or use. The cost of polluting the ocean does not just impact the health of marine ecosystems, but ultimately it has an impact on human health and ecosystems, as we've already heard. As I've previously noted, most of the pollution from the oceans does in fact come from land-based sources, flowing out to the coast from rivers or washed out to sea by storms. Microparticles and liquid pollutants often go unnoticed because they simply don't have a visual impact that plastics and other solid waste do, but they're there. These pollutants can have profound impacts on marine life. Food from the sea that millions of people depend on for their primary nutrition source ultimately can have an impact on human well-being. There have been scientific studies that have shown under high microscopic resolution that small marine creatures actually have particles of plastic and microfibers in them, and we ingest them as well. So it goes up the feeding chain, as it were. Recognizing that the most sustainable and lasting solutions must be grounded in community priorities, and I think the previous speaker has highlighted that for fishers, it really is critical to link improvements in waste management to other positive outcomes such as food security, waste reduction, job creation, tourism opportunities, and public health and safety. The various types of pollution will require a multi-stakeholder approach, a multi-sectoral approach, and one which considers all of the individual sources of pollution, or all the individual sources and actors involved in waste and wastewater management. Preventing marine pollution depends on the actions upstream, on land along the waterways. From UNEP's perspective, we have a program called the Global Program of Action for the Protection of the Environment, of the Marine Environment from Land-Based Activities, which aims to respond to the challenges of wastewater, but also nutrient pollution and marine litter by using the source-to-sea approach, as I mentioned earlier. What is UNEP doing about this? Well, the new normal must instead promote evidence-based action to prevent marine litter and land-based pollution from reaching our waterways, seas, and oceans in the first place. We need to embrace a circular and inclusive economic growth model and promote nature-based solutions in order to improve human well-being and that of the ecosystems which sustain us ultimately. UNEP has designed a comprehensive set of building blocks to provide support to member states in the response and recovery phases of this pandemic to help nations manage COVID-19 waste. It comprises a Building Back Better approach with more integrated, coherent, and coordinated responses in formulating national recovery plans, tackling drivers, and proposing comprehensive and long-term solutions. You can find a number of fact sheets on our website, and I trust that the links to that will be posted. But there are 9 fact sheets that we produced at the very outset of the pandemic that range from general introduction to waste management, how to treat your technology, what are the links to circularity, what are the linkages to air quality in COVID-19, and on and on. So I would encourage you to do a little bit of searching on our website and clicking on the linkages and resources that are provided through this platform.
Thank you, Monika. I think we're going to have, I do want to get 2 questions in. So is that okay if we come to a stop, if you'd like to give a concluding sentence?
Sure. Thanks for that, Aminda. I was just going to talk about some of the gaps that need to be tackled. One of them is certainly on circularity and moving toward better waste management, and also investing in healthy oceans and a cost-effective blue COVID-19 recovery strategy. So I'll stop here then, and perhaps I can answer and add more information in the questions that are being asked. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Monika. I want to get 2 questions in, one for Brian, one for Monika, really, really quickly. I'll start with Brian. You were talking about the new model where fishermen have become more closer to consumers. That was happened over COVID. Do you think that it will continue? Will it grow? Will there be more of this direct connection? If you could answer me in a sentence.
Thanks very much. A sentence is quite difficult to answer in, but certainly I think that will grow. I hope it'll grow, and I hope it'll grow in a way that will be encouraged by the European Union's what's called the farm to fork strategy. I don't know whether you've come across the farm to fork strategy, which is promoting a fair, healthy, and environmentally friendly food system. What we would call a fair and sustainable food system, because I think as the COVID-19 crisis has highlighted, our food system really is not fit for purpose. It's very fragile and very vulnerable to external shock. And by putting consumers and producers more closely together, you can reduce a lot of this fragility and vulnerability to external shock. So certainly this is something that we're going to be working on at Life over the next period, and we hope to work hand in hand with the European Commission and other European institutions on their strategy.
Okay, fantastic. And Monika, last question for you. You were talking about the fact that we're seeing masks and disposable gloves being used during the pandemic, not being disposed of properly and ending up in the oceans. Is there any plan to analyze or tackle this problem at an international level? Again, in a sentence, please.
That's a very good question, and in a sentence, it's very difficult to answer. But I do know that there are studies going on in various academic and other institutes around the world. Certainly, that's where we get our information from. But UNEP, of course, is not a research institute, so we would commission that kind of work, and a lot of that work feeds into the fact sheets that we have, in fact, produced. So yes, I mean, there is this work going on, and we take the best available knowledge in providing our policy recommendations based on the best available science at the time. So we do depend on partners in that regard.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm afraid we had so much to impart that we've now come to the end. It's really been a rush. There's now going to be a 15-minute break for you to stretch your legs and have a brain break before the Life Awards ceremony begins in the auditorium at 3 p.m. And this is not the awards for Brian's Fishers, but they are for the most innovative, inspirational and effective projects that have been co-funded through the EU's LIFE programme for the environment and climate change. I'd like to conclude by thanking all our speakers for their contributions today. It's a shame we couldn't have longer to get into more depth, but I think we've covered a lot of issues. And I'd like to conclude by thanking you, the audience, for your concentration and for your active involvement sending in so many questions. I'm sorry we weren't able to address them all. And with that, I'm now going to bring this session to a close.